Hey, everybody, and welcome to this deep dive where we're going to be looking at something pretty intense, intelligence gathering, and how that bumps up against fundamental rights.
Yes.
And we're going to be taking a look at this from a unique perspective, focusing specifically on Colombia. And to guide us on this journey, we have an incredible expert, Colonel Carlos Soler.
It's great to be here.
Colonel Soler has a fascinating career. Not only is he a military veteran, but he's also been deeply involved in law, human rights, even peace negotiations. So he really knows a thing or two about this balance between national security and individual freedoms. So how does a democratic nation like Colombia walk that tightrope, ensuring security while still upholding its citizens' rights?
Well, that tension is baked right into the Colombian Constitution. It acknowledges that inherent push and pull between a state's need for security and the liberties of its people.
Wow.
And to navigate that, the Colombian Constitutional Court uses what are called tests of ponderation.
Tests of ponderation. It sounds like some kind of high-stakes legal game.
Think of it this way. Let's say authorities want to tap someone's phone. These tests of ponderation would come into play, weighing the potential threat to national security against that person's right to privacy. The Constitution is crystal clear. All state institutions, including intelligence agencies, are bound by law and must respect those fundamental rights.
No exceptions.
And no exceptions.
So even if it's for quote-unquote national security, you can't just steamroll over people's freedoms.
Exactly. And this isn't just talk. Colombia's approach to intelligence has evolved alongside international norms. Democratic intelligence gathering simply can't exist without respect for individual rights.
It makes sense. You can't exactly protect democracy while throwing its core values out the window. So are there safeguards in place to keep things in check?
Absolutely. Judicial oversight, legislative control, citizen access to constitutional protections, they all act as checks and balances on these agencies.
Okay. Before we get too deep into the weeds here, let's define intelligence gathering. It's basically collecting and processing information, right?
Right. But there's a key distinction. OB source intelligence, or OSINT, versus information from closed or confidential sources.
Okay, so OSINT
Yep.
is stuff that's publicly available, like social media or news articles. But the other kind is more like digging into things that aren't meant for public eyes.
Exactly. And here's the thing. Raw information is just that. Raw. It's the transformation of that information into actual intelligence that matters. It has to be analyzed, verified, and assessed for credibility and relevance.
So it's not just hoarding data, it's about making sense of it, figuring out what's actually useful.
Exactly. And all this intelligence gathering has a purpose. It's meant to support decision-making for national security and defense. Think of it as acting preemptively against threats to democracy.
Trying to anticipate problems, maybe even prevent them before they escalate.
Exactly. Take the foiled terrorist plot in 2022. That's a prime example of intelligence agencies using information to prevent a major threat. Now, this intelligence can also be used in legal proceedings, but there are strict rules. Often, judicial authorization is required, especially when you're dealing with fundamental rights like privacy.
You can't just peek into someone's private life because you suspect they might be up to something.
Right. And this brings us to what Colonel Soler calls the red line, that blurry boundary between legitimate intelligence gathering and infringing on rights, like freedom of expression.
That's got to be a tough line to draw. What's a real-world example where things get tricky?
Think about electronic monitoring. Monitoring VHF and UHF frequencies, that's generally fine because those are state-owned. But monitoring cell phone conversations is a different story because those happen on privately leased frequencies. You need judicial oversight to protect privacy there.
So the key is, whether the communication is happening on a public or private frequency, public is fair game, but private needs a warrant.
Essentially, yes. It's all about finding that balance between security needs and the right to privacy.
You mentioned freedom of expression. What about monitoring open source information, like public social media posts? Is that fair game, since there's no expectation of privacy there?
Great question. When you post something publicly, you're essentially giving up any expectation of privacy. So monitoring open source information like that is generally considered legal.
That makes sense. If you're shouting it from the rooftops, you can't really complain when someone overhears you. But things get more complicated when you move from the public square of social media to the private domain of, say, personal emails, right?
Exactly. That's when legal protections kick in. Intercepting those messages requires a judicial warrant. You can't just snoop on someone's private conversations without a good reason.
You mentioned Colonel Soler talks about the difference between strategic intelligence and internal controls. What does that mean?
Strategic intelligence focuses on the big picture, National security and defense, especially during armed conflicts. It's about understanding the broad threats facing the nation.
Less about individual cases and more about analyzing trends and potential threats on a larger scale.
Exactly. Then there's counterintelligence. Think of it as a shield, protecting the government itself. It's about blocking threats, trying to infiltrate state institutions.
Okay, so keeping the bad guys from getting inside and causing chaos. Then there are internal affairs investigations within security forces like the military and police. That involves information analysis and potentially leads to legal actions like searches and arrests.
It's about keeping your own house clean, ensuring that the very people entrusted with protecting the nation are doing their jobs ethically and legally. Another layer of accountability, making sure power isn't being abused within the institutions meant to uphold the law.
It's a lot to think about, all this monitoring and data analysis. It's easy to feel a bit uneasy. How can we be sure that these agencies aren't overstepping?
That's a valid concern. No intelligence activity is exempt from scrutiny. The Colombian Constitutional Court has issued rulings protecting the right to privacy, and international human rights standards play a major role in shaping these principles.
So there's a legal framework, both domestically and internationally, to prevent abuses.
Exactly. And robust oversight mechanisms are crucial to prevent the misuse of intelligence for political purposes or persecution.
But with technology constantly evolving, this balance between security and freedom must be getting harder to maintain.
Absolutely. The rapid advancements in technology, especially in areas like artificial intelligence, are creating new challenges. We need constant legal and regulatory adaptation.
It's not a set it and forget it situation. The rules of the game are always changing as technology advances.
Exactly. It's a dynamic process,
Mm.
requiring constant vigilance and a willingness to adapt to new realities.
It's amazing how much emphasis Colonel Solar puts on those legal frameworks and oversight. It's not just about having the tech to gather the information, it's about using it ethically.
He's absolutely clear on that. Intelligence agencies shouldn't be operating in a vacuum.
Yeah.
There has to be that system of checks and balances.
That makes me think about those real-world cases, where those lines get crossed. Have there been instances of intelligence gathering going too far, even in democratic countries?
Unfortunately, yes. History is full of examples where intelligence agencies overstepped, even in nations that pride themselves on civil liberties.
It's a reminder that that potential for abuse is always there. We need those checks and balances you mentioned to keep things in check.
Exactly. It's a constant tension, this balance between security and freedom. We need to make sure the scales don't tip too far in either direction.
So it's not just about having good laws on the books. It's about actually enforcing them and holding people accountable when those lines are crossed.
That's where oversight plays such a vital role. Independent bodies, like parliamentary committees or judicial watchdogs, are so critical. They scrutinize the activities of intelligence agencies and make sure they're operating within the law.
It sounds like we need a whole ecosystem here. Legal frameworks, oversight mechanisms, and public awareness.
We do. And every democratic society has to wrestle with these questions. The stakes are high. And Colonel Solar's insights really offer a roadmap for navigating these challenges.
He also stresses that this is an ongoing conversation. Technology is constantly evolving, so our legal and ethical frameworks need to keep pace.
He uses the example of artificial intelligence, which presents both incredible opportunities and unprecedented challenges for intelligence gathering.
AI can analyze massive amounts of data in the blink of an eye, finding patterns and connections that humans might miss. But it also raises concerns about bias, privacy, and misuse.
Absolutely. That's why the human element is still so important. We need experts who understand both the power and the limitations of these technologies to ensure they're being used responsibly.
So the future of intelligence gathering needs to be a blend of cutting-edge technology and strong ethical principles.
I think that's a great way to put it. It's not one or the other. We need both to ensure that security and freedom can coexist.
This deep dive has given me a lot to think about. It's easy to take our freedoms for granted, but this conversation really highlights the work it takes to protect them.
And it underscores the importance of informed citizens who understand these issues and demand accountability from their leaders.
Well said. I think Colonel Solar would agree with that. It's not just about Colombia, is it? These issues are universal. Every democratic society faces similar challenges.
Exactly. Balancing security and freedom is something we all have to grapple with.
So here's something for our listeners to consider. Research examples of when intelligence gathering went too far, crossed ethical or legal lines, in other countries. It can be really eye-opening to see how these issues play out in different contexts. Think about the lessons we can learn from those cases. How can we as citizens ensure our governments are using these powerful tools responsibly and ethically? It's a question worth pondering.
It is, and it's a conversation that needs to continue.
Thinking about those real-world cases where intelligence gathering has kind of gone off the rails, it really hits home that this isn't just, you know, some abstract discussion in a classroom. These issues have
Right.
real consequences for people's lives.
Absolutely. When intelligence agencies overstep their bounds, it erodes trust in government, it can have a chilling effect on free speech, and even lead to wrongful convictions. The stakes are incredibly high.
And as technology continues to advance, those stakes just get higher and higher. We've seen how AI and other emerging technologies are transforming the intelligence landscape, which is exciting, but also kind of terrifying.
Yeah, it's a classic double-edged sword. We gain incredible power, but we need to be incredibly careful about how we wield it. The potential benefits are enormous. Imagine being able to predict and prevent terrorist attacks, or track down criminals who are hiding in the darkest corners of the internet. But the potential for misuse
Yeah.
is equally vast.
So how do we learn from the past to make sure that we're using these incredibly powerful tools the right way?
That's where those lessons from past mistakes become so crucial. We need to study those cases, understand what went wrong, and build in safeguards to our systems to prevent those mistakes from happening again. It's like learning from history so we don't repeat it, but on a technological scale.
It sounds like we can't afford to be complacent. We need to constantly be questioning, challenging, and adapting our approach to intelligence gathering.
Exactly. And that's where the role of informed citizens comes in. We can't just leave these issues to the experts. We all have a responsibility to understand the trade-offs involved and to demand accountability from our leaders. Democracy thrives on informed participation.
So what's the one key message we want our listeners to take away from this deep dive?
Well, I think the balance between security and freedom is delicate and requires constant vigilance. We can't afford to be complacent. We need to stay informed and hold our leaders accountable. The future of our freedoms depends on it.
Well said. And on that note, I think we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this fascinating and important exploration. We hope it sparks some curiosity, some critical thinking, and maybe even a little healthy skepticism. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep demanding better from the world around you.